In the autumn of 1600, a fleet of Spanish galleons limped into the harbor at Seville, riding low in the water under the weight of nearly 200 tons of Peruvian silver. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered on the docks, some of them the same families who had gathered 100 times before for 100 other fleets, because this was, by then, a ritual as old as living memory. For a moment, it looked like exactly what the history books say it was, proof that Spain owned the richest empire the world had ever seen, an empire stretching from Manila to Madrid, from the silver mountains of Potosi to the palaces of Castile, an empire on which, quite literally, the sun never set. What the crowds on that dock did not know, what most people still don't know, is that the silver in those holds was already spent. Not spent in the sense of squandered on luxury, though there was plenty of that too. Spent in the much colder, much more dangerous sense, mortgaged months in advance to bankers in Genoa and Augsburg who had extended the Spanish crown credit against a shipment that hadn't even left the New World yet. By the time that silver touched Spanish soil, contractually on paper, in ledgers written in Italian and German hundreds of miles away, it belonged in every way that mattered to someone else. Here's the number that should follow you through everything else in this video. 4. 4 times in less than a century, the richest monarchy on Earth, sitting on top of the largest supply of precious metal in human history, formally defaulted on its debts. Not once as a fluke of bad luck or a single lost war. 4 times, 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596. A pattern, not an accident. And by the end of this video, you'll understand that pattern wasn't a failure of the Spanish Empire. It was the machine working exactly as its financiers designed it to work. This is the story history textbooks simplify into gold and glory, conquistadors, galleons, an empire built on plunder. What they leave out is the ledger. And the ledger tells you something the paintings never will. Spain wasn't rich. Spain was the most spectacular case of leveraged debt in the early modern world, and the men who structured that debt understood the empire's finances better than the emperor himself did. Let's follow the money. Ask most people what powered the Spanish Empire, and you'll get the same answer: silver. Boatloads of it hauled out of the mountain of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, a single mountain so rich in ore that Spaniards called it simply the mountain that eats men, a name earned by the scale of indigenous and enslaved forced labor consumed extracting it. Between 1500 and 1650, conservative estimates put the silver flowing from the Americas into Spain at somewhere around 16,000 tons, an amount so large it eventually reshaped price levels across the entire European continent, an era economic historians still call the price revolution. By every intuitive measure, this should have made Spain the wealthiest, most financially secure state on the continent. It did not. Here's what most people miss. Raw resource wealth and financial solvency are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where empires actually live or die. A kingdom can control a literal mountain of silver and still be, in every meaningful accounting sense, insolvent, because wealth flowing in means nothing against obligations that are already larger and already spent before the wealth arrives. Spain's problem was never a shortage of silver. It was that the silver was arriving to pay off debts already incurred to fund the wars, the court, and the sprawling administration of an empire that had expanded faster than any tax base could support. Because here's the uncomfortable truth underneath the treasure fleet paintings. The Spanish crown was almost never solvent enough to fight its wars on its own income. Castile's tax revenues, the actual reliable domestic income of the kingdom, drawn from sales taxes, customs duties, and church contributions, were a fraction of what it cost to garrison the Netherlands against open rebellion, patrol the Western Mediterranean against Ottoman and Barbary fleets, defend Italian territories from French ambition, and administer a global trade network stretching all the way to Manila. The gap between what Spain earned and what Spain spent had to be filled by someone, every single year, in peace and in war alike. And the people who filled it were not Spanish. They were Genoese and German, and they had been filling that gap since before a single ingot of American silver had ever crossed the Atlantic. This is the part of the story the treasure fleet imagery is specifically designed to obscure, because it flatters a version of history where Spanish gold built a Spanish empire, funded by Spanish money for Spanish glory. The reality runs through a financial instrument most people have never heard of, and once you understand it, you can never watch a treasure fleet painting the same way again: the asiento. An asiento was, at its simplest, a short-term loan contract between the Spanish crown and a private banking house, usually German in the earlier decades of the century, increasingly Genoese Italian as the century wore on. The mechanism was almost always the same. The crown needed cash immediately, to pay soldiers garrisoned in Flanders who would mutiny without wages, to provision a war fleet before a campaign season closed, to bribe a rival prince, to cover a court expense that could not wait. The silver fleets, meanwhile, were months away at best, subject to Atlantic storms, English and French privateers, and the simple, brutal unpredictability of transoceanic shipping in an age before reliable navigation. So the crown borrowed against silver that had not yet arrived, at interest rates that reflected exactly how much risk the lender was absorbing, and exactly how little leverage a desperate crown had left to negotiate. The first great financiers of this system were German, the Fugger banking dynasty of Augsburg, a family whose name should be as recognizable today as the Medici, and rarely is, despite financing Habsburg emperors, controlling German silver and copper mines outright, and most consequentially, bankrolling Charles V's campaign to be elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. That election was, in practice, a bribery operation on a continental scale, funneling money to the electors who would decide the imperial crown, and it was so expensive that it makes modern campaign finance look almost quaint by comparison. The Fuggers didn't merely lend the money for it. They took mining concessions, tax farms, and strategic collateral in return, meaning that when Spain and the broader Habsburg Empire borrowed to fight a war, it was routinely signing away future revenue streams, mines, tax farms, entire administrative districts, before that revenue had even materialized. By the reign of Philip II, the baton had largely passed to Genoese bankers, a rotating cast of financial houses, families like the Spinola and the Grimaldi among others, who specialized in something the Fuggers eventually could not sustain, absorbing the risk of a crown that defaulted again and again, and finding a way to keep lending anyway, because the alternative was losing everything already owed. This is the part that sounds almost impossible until you understand the mechanism underneath it. The Genoese bankers restructured Spanish debt after every default into new instruments called giros, long-term annuity bonds, that converted a collapsed short-term loan into a slower-bleeding long-term obligation, still technically being serviced, just stretched out long enough that the crown could function again, borrow again, and eventually default again on the new terms too. Default didn't end the relationship between crown and banker. Default reset it, and every reset came on terms that favored the lender a little more than the last one had. Here's who really owned the silver before it ever reached Madrid. Contractually, in the accounting ledgers of Genoa and Augsburg, a significant portion of every incoming shipment was already earmarked before the ships ever left port in the Americas. The dockworkers cheering on the pier in 1600 were watching Genoese collateral arrive, dressed up as a national triumph, and there was no way for them to know it, because the entire system was built to look like Spanish wealth arriving home rather than foreign debt being repaid. Philip II inherited an empire and, functionally, a debt structure he could not escape, one built up over decades by his father Charles V's wars across Germany, Italy, and against France. He is remembered accurately as one of history's most powerful monarchs, ruling Spain, Portugal after 1580, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and a colonial empire spanning two hemispheres, an empire on which, again quite literally, the sun genuinely never set. He is remembered far less often as a serial defaulter, a king who declared his own crown's finances bankrupt not once but repeatedly, because the machinery of imperial war had permanently outpaced any plausible income the kingdom could generate. The Fugger family, at the height of their influence, had effectively become an arm of Habsburg state finance without ever holding a single title of nobility for it. Their ledgers moved armies as surely as any generals ordered. When Spanish troops garrisoned in the Netherlands went unpaid and mutinied, as they did, repeatedly, most infamously sacking the city of Antwerp in 1576, in an episode so brutal it became known across Europe as the Spanish Fury, with thousands of civilians killed and much of the city burned. You are looking, indirectly, at a banking failure translated into a massacre. The money that should have paid those soldiers was tied up in the aftermath of a prior default, restructured into a bond the crown was still servicing, unable to free up the cash the garrison needed to simply eat. The Genoese bankers, who inherited the Spanish account after the Fuggers gradually pulled back, were, if anything, more sophisticated. They understood something Philip II's own treasury seemingly could never fully accept, that lending to a serial defaulter can still be extremely profitable if you structure the loan correctly, take sufficient collateral against specific tax revenues, and remain willing to renegotiate rather than simply walk away and lose everything already extended. This is functionally the same logic that governs modern sovereign debt restructuring, Argentina in the early 2000s, Greece after 2010, name your own example, and it was being pioneered in practice on the back of Habsburg Spain 400 years before anyone wrote it into an economics textbook or gave it an academic name. If you'll forgive one moment of stepping outside the story, it was the Fuggers who financed the emperor's crown. It was the Fuggers who financed his silver mines in the Tyrol and in Spain itself. It was the Fuggers who financed the very campaign that made him emperor in the first place. And when the Fuggers finally stepped back, unwilling to keep absorbing the losses, it was the Genoese who financed his son's wars, his son's fleet, his son's empire, an empire that, on the balance sheet, belonged to Genoa in every way that mattered except the crown stamped onto the coins. Here's what the treasure fleet paintings never show you: the moment the crown simply stopped paying. 1557 is the year to remember because it's the first, and arguably the most consequential. Philip II, drowning in obligations inherited from his father's wars and compounded by his own ongoing conflict with France, formally suspended payments on the outstanding asientos, simply stopped servicing the short-term loans his own treasury had signed. The immediate effect was a banking crisis that rippled outward through Genoa and Augsburg simultaneously, because the financiers who had lent against future Spanish silver suddenly found themselves holding paper the crown flatly would not honor. But here's the part that reveals how the system actually worked underneath the crisis. This did not end Spain's access to credit, it restructured it. The unpaid asientos were converted into juros, long-term bonds paying lower but guaranteed interest. Backed by specific tax revenues, the crown formally pledged as collateral going forward. The bankers accepted a worse short-term deal in exchange for a more secure long-term one. Spain got breathing room to keep functioning. And critically, Spain kept borrowing almost immediately afterward, because the entire imperial war machine, the Netherlands garrison, the Mediterranean fleet, and eventually the Armada against England, could not function for even a single season without fresh credit. 1560 came next, smaller in scale but part of the exact same underlying pattern. Obligations quietly outpacing revenue year after year, another suspension, another renegotiation, another round of juros layered on top of the ones still outstanding from 3 years earlier. Then 1575, arguably the most devastating of the four, arriving in the middle of the Dutch revolt, the long, grinding war to hold on to a rebellious Netherlands, a conflict that consumed Spanish silver faster than any single expense in the entire empire. The 1575 default triggered a full banking collapse among the Genoese houses most heavily exposed to Spanish debt, and it directly caused the unpaid, starving, mutinous garrison collapse that led to the sack of Antwerp the following year. A financial decision made in a treasury office in Madrid became a massacre in Flanders less than 12 months later. That is what follow the money actually means in practice. It is not a metaphor. It is a direct, traceable, documented causal chain from a ledger entry to a burning city. And then 1596, the fourth default, arriving after the failed Spanish Armada of 1588 had already drained the treasury of resources it would never fully recover. By this point, the pattern was so well understood by European financiers that a future Spanish default had essentially been priced into every new loan from the moment it was signed, which is precisely why the interest rates Spain paid never meaningfully came down, no matter how much fresh New World silver kept arriving on the docks of Seville. The silver was never fixing the underlying structural problem. It was simply funding the next war until the next inevitable collapse. 4 defaults, 80 years. An empire that, at its financial core, was permanently structured around short-term borrowing it could not structurally sustain, propped up not by silver itself, but by the ongoing willingness of foreign bankers to keep renegotiating the terms of a debt that never actually shrank, only changed shape. Here is the thesis this channel keeps returning to, because history keeps proving it true. This pattern did not end with Spain, and it did not end in the 16th century. A state fights wars it cannot fund out of ordinary revenue. It borrows against future income, future silver, future tax collection, future economic growth, whatever the era's version of collateral happens to be. The lenders who extend that credit accumulate influence that rivals, or in practice exceeds, the formal political power of the state itself, because a government that depends on your money to fund its next campaign is a government you can quietly steer without ever holding office. When the resulting debt becomes unsustainable, it is almost never simply canceled. It is restructured, stretched, refinanced, in a way that keeps the borrower solvent just long enough to come back and borrow again. Spain's empire did not fall because it ran out of silver. 16,000 tons of the metal flowed through Spanish hands and out the other side almost as fast as it arrived, because the empire's wars were structurally more expensive than its income in every single generation, for a century and a half straight. The Golden Glory version of this story asks you to believe an empire that controlled that much precious metal simply overspent out of arrogance and excess. The ledger tells a colder, more mechanical story. The overspending was baked into the model from the moment the crown first started borrowing against silver that hadn't even left the mine yet, and the men who benefited from that arrangement had every financial incentive to keep it running exactly as long as they possibly could. So here's the question worth sitting with after everything you've just heard. Every major power in the modern world finances its wars, at least in part, the same way Philip I financed his, through debt sold to lenders who profit whether the war is won or lost. The instruments have new names now: sovereign bonds instead of asientos, central banks and institutional bondholders instead of the Fuggers and the Genoese. But the underlying mechanism, a government borrowing against a future it cannot fully guarantee, has not meaningfully changed in 450 years. Which nation do you think is running Philip II's playbook right now, and which financiers are quietly holding the paper? Put your answer in the comments. You might be more right than you think.